Good morning. Well, let me ask you this question. Has anyone ever said something like this to you? Are you out of your mind? Okay, at least some of you are smiling and laughing. Now, I ask this question because I would like to suggest that the perfect title for today's gospel is this: He is out of his mind. At least that's what people are saying. Everyone seems to be talking about Jesus. Now, Jesus has been healing people who were possessed and sick right and left and right. And he is so busy doing so that Mark tells us they did not even have time to eat. Now, Jesus' mother and relatives hear about it. They find out what people are saying about Jesus. And they set out on a long journey from Nazareth to Capernaum to rescue Jesus, to seize him. And it took them 2 days to get there. And as they go, they must be wondering, has Jesus lost his mind? What's going on? Now, in the meantime, it gets even worse. The scribes who came from Jerusalem accused Jesus of being possessed by demons. Mark tells us the scribes who had come from Jerusalem said, "He is possessed by Beelzebub, and by the prince of demons, he drives out demons." So now they, the family of Jesus, finally, they arrive to Capernaum, all worried and eager to find out what's going on. They most likely went to Peter's house, right by the Sea of Galilee. Jesus used to stay there all the time. And the house of Peter is as close to the synagogue where Jesus was healing people, as close to the synagogue as St. Patrick's is to Harry's Pizza. Not that far away. Now, Mark continues. His mother and his brothers arrived. Standing outside, they sent word to him and called him. A crowd seated around him told him, "Your mother and your brothers and your sisters are outside asking for you." Now, Jesus' response is rather shocking. He says, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And then notice, he answers his own question. And he continues, "Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." Now, this statement and this entire story can appear to contradict our image of the Holy Family, always united and in perfect agreement. But that's not the only story like this. Do you remember when Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem in the Gospel of Luke, when he was a boy, and his parents frantically were looking for him, only to realize that he was in the synagogue in Jerusalem teaching. So they go back to Jerusalem and they basically say to Jesus, "Why did you do this to us? We were so worried." Now, any parent can identify with these statements. Now, Jesus' response is again somewhat shocking. He says to them, "Why were you searching for me? Didn't you know that I must be in my Father's house?" They did not understand what he meant, Luke tells us. And they went back to Nazareth, and Luke says something very interesting. He says, Jesus was obedient to them. And Mary treasured all these things in her heart, and Jesus grew in wisdom. Now, today's gospel and the story from Luke tell us something interesting. Namely, that there were occasions of tension within Jesus' family, here and there. Now, it does not mean that Jesus did not love his mother and his father and close relatives and vice versa. It just means they were as human as we are. Now, I find it rather consoling to know that even within Jesus' family, there were occasional tensions, misunderstandings, and even conflicts. It is true of any family. It's true of our church, really of any community or group. Tensions and conflicts are inevitable. Now, the fact that we find these kind of stories in the Gospels, as embarrassing as they may appear to be, tells us that they really had to happen. The authors of the Gospel of Mark or Luke would not invent them. That would just not make any sense. But what strikes me here is this: how patient with each other Mary and Jesus are. Mary treasures all these things in her heart. They talk to each other. They take time to figure it out. These stories make Jesus and his family real and human. And a family we all can relate to. Jesus and Mary teach us how to walk together when we find ourselves in conflict with one another. See, the main point here is not even the conflict. He is out of his mind. That's the setting. The main point is that in that moment, or in those moments, they listen to one another. And because they do, they learn more about who Jesus is, what his mission is, what and why he is doing what he is doing. It just takes time. But they can do so because they are patient with each other and they listen. And that's love, isn't it? You know, when Paul wrote to the church in Corinth, they were in conflict, in tensions, fighting with one another. Jewish Christians and the Gentile Christians. And Paul encourages them in this famous passage read at most of the weddings. He encourages them to strive for the greatest gift of all gifts. And do you remember what that gift is? Love. And then the first adjective he uses to describe love is this. He says, love is patient. That's what we see in these stories. In Jerusalem, in Capernaum, we see that loving patience. And maybe that's what Mary and Jesus are inviting us to think about and reflect upon. That when we find ourselves in those situations of tension and conflict, to be patient with one another, to listen to one another, to talk, to give it time. You know? To me, the lesson of today's gospel is simple and actually kind of surprising. How can conflict be an occasion to learn more about one another?